across zoos, because as Paul also mentioned, zoos will be different in terms of husbandry, management, even climate, the weather, the temperature, all of that may vary across zoos. But we can use to compare how those have an impact, the relative effect of those different variables on behavior, health, welfare, breeding success of animals across zoos. And that can be very, very useful to draw a picture of what are some zoos doing right. So if some zoos are being very successful at breeding a particular species while others are not, if some zoos have a particularly high mortality or low or high mortality of a species, or if you visit and even the behavior differs across zoos, some zoos have higher rates of negative behavioral indicators of welfare, while others not so much. We can use multi-zoo studies to compare and try to determine what are some zoos doing right, why are they being successful in a particular aspect, and what can other zoos do better in order to improve a particular aspect. And this is particularly useful if we have little knowledge of what's going on with the population. So if we're working with an animal species that we know very little about, they are in a number of zoos, but we don't know what's going on with them. We don't even know where to start. We know there's a particular issue. Let's imagine high mortality or low breeding success, but we don't know what to start. We don't know what's the issue because there's been very little research on them. Then it's really, really useful to start with a multi-zoo study because you can start drawing a picture. So you can have an idea of, out of all these different variables that may be impacting that particular factor, which could be breeding success, for example, out of all those variables, which ones may be having a stronger effect. And a multi-zoo study can be very, very useful for that. However, that comes with a few challenges. Multi-zoo studies can be logistically more complex because they may require more paperwork, like, for example, research proposals to different zoos. Not all zoos require research proposals, but a lot of them do. A lot of them require a bit of more of a bureaucratic process than others, but nevertheless, if you're dealing with multiple zoos, then you'll probably have to deal with more paperwork. You'll also have to work with more people. So you'll have to be liaising with multiple people, which is zoo staff, depending on which zoo staff you need help from, multiple zoos, multiple organizations, and all of that is more logistically complex. It can be potentially costly or resource intensive. It may be time consuming because, again, you're engaging with multiple people, multiple organizations. If you actually have to visit multiple zoos, it is potentially costly because there may be a lot of traveling involved, which is a lot of fun, I know, but usually quite expensive as well. And there's also a good chance that something will not go according to plan. So on the bright side, if you have many zoos and a large sample size, if one or two, you end up having to drop one or two because, unexpected things happen, it's not a big deal. But it is likely that something will happen with so many zoos and so many animals involved that there'll be some unexpected events that may disturb your research project a little bit. So what's very, very important to try and deal and avoid those potential challenges the best we can is to plan and prepare in the best way we can. And something that is very, very important to consider from the start is partnerships and support. You need to bring on board with your project all the relevant people and organizations that will be able to support that project. So, for example, at the BIAZA level, we've got the BIAZA Research Committee, which provides a review of research proposals for projects that involve multiple BIAZA members. So if you're interested in conducting a research project that involves multiple zoos or multiple institutions, then you can request the support of the BIAZA Research Committee. And what we do in the committee is we review the proposal, we may ask for more information, and we provide a stamp of approval, an endorsement if we're happy with the proposal. You still have to go through the process of research proposals and bringing individual zoos on board. You still have to do that. But by having that endorsement from the research committee, you're more likely to have the individual zoos on board more easily. And there are other examples, not just this, the BIAZA Research Committee's endorsement will be at the BIAZA level, but for example, at the IAZA level, you'll have the European ex situ programs coordinators for different species, and the coordinators of those programs, they will be able to support your project and also ask individual zoos that are part of that EEP to support your project, and if they are on board with it. So again, it's very, very important to engage and communicate with the relevant people so you can bring them on board with your project and you can get that support. And usually when you are engaging and you're asking for that support, usually you need to explain, why does your project deserve that support? Why is it worth the time and effort of multiple zoos? Because if you want to engage with multiple zoos, you'll be asking things for multiple zoos, and you need to show when you're asking for support, why is it worth, what do your potential zoo partners have to gain from your research? And something that you can start with is to ask whether your project aligns with their current research priorities. Now, research priorities is a list of research topics that are being prioritized in that moment in time, that have been identified as research gaps, and that particular zoo or that particular organization identified that gap and would need some research and an answer for. So if your project aligns with their current research priorities, you're already in a very good place to get your project endorsed. It doesn't mean that other projects that are not at the time in the research priorities list won't be supported. That's not the case. But if your project already aligns with those research priorities, then yes, you're in a good place to get your endorsement or support for your project. Collaborations, more on this because they're very, very important. And what you need to do from the start when you are engaging and communicating with your zoo partners about a research project is to be very transparent from the start. So make it very clear from the start exactly what you need from your zoo partners. And that may be a handful of things, from staff time. So how much time will you require of different staff members, which could be the zookeepers, veterinarians, educators, any zoo staff members that may need to be involved with your project and may need to spend some time involved with your project. You have to make it clear from the start, tell the zoos exactly how much time you need from their staff. Particular resources, so for projects that involve, for example, if you're testing an enrichment or if you are trialing some modifications to the enclosure, of course, you need to bring the zoo on board with the idea, whether they're happy or not with that kind of manipulation in their facilities. But also you need to make it clear whether you need any resources from the zoo, whether, for example, if you need materials for those modifications, whether it's the zoo that will need to provide those materials, or whether you already somehow have the funding for that. So very, very important to be transparent about that. Funding or other support. So if you need funding for your study, you can request. Chances are that you won't get it because it's very difficult to get funding. But again, it's important to make it clear whether you need funding or you already have it. Or other support, for example, accumulation. If you're visiting multiple zoos, some of them may be able to provide you with free or cheaper accumulation. Some of them may not. Not all of the zoos have those facilities to provide that, but some do. So that's something you can inquire from the start to see how much support the zoo can and wants to give you. Data or information, do you need records from them? Do you want them to complete questionnaires? If it's to complete questionnaires, it will require a fair amount of staff time. So all those things you have to consider, and you have to communicate to the zoo what you'll be needing. And finally, whether you need to ask the zoo to avoid some husbandry or management changes during the study. So for example, if you are doing behavioral observations of a zoo or a number of zoos of red pandas for a few months, you want to ask the zoo whether, of course, that's a possibility, whether the zoo is expecting any changes. Is that red panda, the red pandas that you want to study, are they moving to another zoo after 2 months? Because if that's the case, you will interrupt your data collection and you'll have a bit of an issue there. So try to engage with the zoo so you can clarify, okay, I want to study these animals for 6 months. Will these animals be there to the best of your abilities? Unexpected things may happen, and there's not much we can do about that. But for the things we can control, what we can do is engage with the zoo and explain, I want to study these animals for a number of months. Can you avoid, to the best of your abilities, any husbandry, management changes, transfers during that period to avoid adding those annoying confounding variables to your study? If the zoo is on board and agrees to it, you stand a better chance of avoiding those annoying changes. But like I said, sometimes they do still happen because there are things that are outside our control and outside the control of the zoo as well. Timeline. So very, very important to plan a sensible timeline, and that accounts for potential issues and delays. So remember that it may take longer than expected to hear back from zoos. So if you are sending a research proposal to ask whether you can conduct a certain research project, research study at the zoo, give it enough time. You can ask on average how long usually takes for you to be aware of it, but make sure you give the zoo enough time to review, and sometimes it may take a while. Zoos are busy, zoo staff are busy, but give them enough time to review the proposal, sometimes to go back to you to request changes and edits, and it may take a while to actually get approved so you can continue or start your study. So make sure you give enough time for that. Again, if you're sending things like questionnaires to zoo, it sometimes takes a long time, and a few gentle reminders and nudges for you to hear back from all the zoos. Likely is that you won't hear from all the zoos, but you will want to hear from most zoos. And even then, it can take a while. So account for that when you're planning a timeline. If you're visiting multiple zoos, so if it's the kind of study where you have to physically visit a lot of zoos for example, behavioral data collection, then make sure that you plan for unexpected issues. So for example, if you're visiting many zoos for a period of time, and you need a week, 7 days of observations of an animal on each zoo, for example, then if you need 7 days of data collection, don't just plan spending 7 days on that zoo. Give it a bit of room to make sure that if something happens, you may be able to, for example, switch the day and do the behavioral data collection in another day because you have a few extra days to play with. I know this can be difficult to do because sometimes you're on a budget and you just can't, and you are restricted in terms of time, I know, but it's about finding the right balance. Maybe sometimes it's better to reduce the number of zoos a little bit, but to have enough time in each zoo to account for potential issues, which maybe some of these issues may not be solved with just a few extra days, unfortunately, but some of them may, if it's just, a disruption of a few hours in a particular day you had planned. If you have an extra day, you can then switch those observations for a day. So try and account for that. And of course, if your research is reliant on zoo staff to do certain things at certain times, make sure, again, that you're transparent and clear and that you agree with them what they need to do, when they need to do, and also, of course, that you give them enough time to do them. So again, liaise with the zoos, with the potential partners to plan the sensible timeline, make sure they are on board with the timeline, they understand and agree to it. So, when the time is that you need the zoo staff to do certain things, again, unexpected things may happen, but if you have a solid plan that the zoo is on board with, you're less likely to have issues with the implementation of that plan. Another very, very important aspect is communication. It really is key for a successful research collaboration with the zoo. And this is a very good example of a paper that investigated collaborations between academic organizations and zoos. And when zoo staff was asked how likely they were to consider future collaboration with the same person or group that they've done research with, if they had done a number of things, we can see that, of course, when there was good communication, when the zoo was brought on board with the plan, when the zoo staff was allowed to participate in the process, provide suggestions, and see those suggestions implemented, they were more likely to want to consider a future collaboration with that same researcher. However, when there were issues like lack of transparency, things like failing to credit the zoo. Paul touched on that already. So if you have a zoo partner, make sure the zoo gets the deserved credit for being part of your project. Posting questionable content on social media. Of course, being rude or dismissive towards the staff. That's no brainer that people, if you're rude towards someone, they won't want to work with you again. Were reckless or negligent towards an animal. So it's about having a respectful conduct, being consider our partners and communicate effectively with them. And again, listen and implement the suggestions from the zoo staff. And always remember, the zoo staff are working with you, not for you. This is very, very important to remember. I know there are times where you may be prioritizing your project, but it's very, very important to make sure that you bring in your zoo partners, the zoo staff you're working with, on board with the entire process. It's likely that there'll be frustrating delays, change of plans. They're likely to happen, but try to stay calm, try to be patient and polite when communicating. When these delays happen, it's never, or I think it's really, really rare or unlikely that those delays will be because zoo staff is deliberately trying to damage your research. Of course not. For the most part, in my case, always, zoo staff that's working with you, they're extremely keen on your project. They're really supportive. They really want to see you and your research project succeed. Also, because they want the findings, the outcomes of the project to inform their management and husbandry practices. However, there are other things happening. They have their own jobs. They have their own schedules. Sometimes they're very busy, and sometimes they have to prioritize their own work, which is, of course, fair enough. And it can get frustrating for us because we get the pressure of our projects of wanting to get our work done, and then there are all these delays happening. And you may be saying, there's no way I would ever be rude or dismissive towards someone I've been engaging with. But you'd be surprised if you're under pressure, if you're really stressed because your project is not going your way and things keep happening that keep delaying it. It's really easy to even if accidentally not planning to, but be rude or fail in effectively communicate with your partners. And that can really, really harm your research project further. It can harm your collaboration. So really, really keep this in mind and try to find healthier ways of dealing with your frustration before engaging with your partners or collaborators. Now, a couple of examples. And yes, Paul, I did have to include a mouse there in this presentation somewhere. So as Paul mentioned before, I've been engaged in some multi-zoo studies in the past. This is one of my first large research project that involved a lot of zoos. And it was about the mouse deer, which for those that don't know are these very adorable creatures. Ungulates, not a true deer, not a mouse, but they are ungulates and they are related to the deer. They have been in European zoos for many, many, many years. But at the time of my study, when I started and got involved with this project, there was very little we knew about these animals, even though they had been kept in zoos for decades. So what we needed here, because I had very little to start with, very little information, very little knowledge. I wanted to have a general idea of what was going on in zoos with these animals. I already knew that breeding success was very inconsistent across zoos, and that's why I was brought on board with this project, because that had already been identified as an issue, but we had no idea what was causing this inconsistency in breeding success across zoos. So what I did is I sent questionnaires to 22 zoos. So these were all the zoos that had these species, this taxonomic group in Europe. And then I also visited 15 zoos for behavioral data collection. These were 15 zoos in 9 countries that I visited in 4 months. So I did all this behavioral data collection in one go across 4 months. And one of the key aspects of the success of this project was having the support of the EP coordinator, who was Artie's Zoo, Christian Willard at Artie's Zoo. And that support was absolutely key. Of course, I still had to liaise and communicate with each zoo I brought on board. So I still had to do that. But having that support from the EP that was kind of nudging and encouraging the zoos to engage with my project by saying, we really need this research. We really need to find out more about this. So please support Ricardo's research. And I think having that support was really, really a key aspect of it. Things that I may have not done so well that I underestimated at the time was I underestimated time for research proposals. And that's something I definitely learned from my mistake. So even though I had the support of the EP, again, I still had to send research proposals for the zoos that requested them. And those research proposals, even with the support of the EP, still had to be reviewed by the zoos. And like I said, this can be a lengthy process, and rightfully so. The zoos are busy. They want to make sure it's a worthy research project to engage with. So that started, the start of the data collection wasn't so great because the first zoo I had lined up for my behavioral data collection did not get back to me in time with an approval for the research proposal. Thankfully, I could just move that zoo to the end of the list and start a bit later with the second zoo. It wasn't a big deal, but that's definitely something I learned, was give it enough time for zoos to review and get back to you on your research proposals. And even though I had some careful planning and communicated with the zoos, there were still some expected events. I gave it a few extra days for data collection in each of the zoos, but I still had to exclude a couple of zoos because when I got there, one of the animals had been isolated because of illness or transfer, unexpected events, nothing that had been planned. It wasn't, of course, anyone's fault. It was things that happen with live animals. Thankfully, because I had a good number of zoos to work with, excluding those 2 zoos wasn't a big deal. But this is just to highlight that these unexpected events can and will likely happen if you're working with live animals. And a second example, not as much of a multi-zoo study because only 2 zoos were involved. However, for this project, it required more time and resource investment from each of the zoos, meaning that successful communication with those 2 zoo partners was really, really important. So the aim of this study was to enable natural behaviors in captive parrots by modifying their enclosure with evidence-based modifications. And of course, what I needed from the zoo was to implement certain enclosure modifications at a period of time for me to evaluate the impact of those on the behavior of the animals. To achieve that, there were many, many months of planning and successful communications. My 2 zoo partners for this project, Jurong Bird Park in Singapore and Drayton Manor in the UK, they were both absolutely incredible and supportive, so I was very, very lucky. But that involved a lot of engaging and communication with them. But even all those months of planning, I had a beautiful plan that I was very proud of and very excited. And then COVID-19 happened at the very middle of my PhD, which was, of course, very disruptive. Obviously, I was not accounting in my beautiful plan to have a global pandemic hitting in the middle of my project, which was, of course, very stressful, very frustrating. There were mitigations that were planned and applied as much as possible with involvement, again, of my 2 zoo partners, of my supervisor, of everyone involved. But of course, the project was still affected because there were things that were outside of my control, because I couldn't go back to my zoo partners to complete my data collection. It took me a while for me to be able to go back. And that extended period, what it did was to add those annoying confounding variables to my project, to my findings, to my data, which is not ideal. I did not love it, but I had to deal with it. It was outside of my control. I planned it to the best of my ability. And what that happens, it was what Paul said. You have to acknowledge the data you have. You have to acknowledge the limitations you have and what they mean for your data. If you cannot get as many conclusions from your data because those extra confounding variables, that's what it is. It's still valid data. It's still useful data. Just acknowledge what you have and what are those limitations. And just a very quick side note, it's not directly to do with what I've been talking about, but it's something I really want to touch on because now that I am a supervisor for students' research projects, and I've been approached by students that are, from the start, their main concern is, I want to do a project where it's likely to get statistically significant results. And I just want to highlight that I do get that, getting those significant results when you're doing a research project, it's really exciting. If you are doing an enrichment study, you want to see those significant changes in the behavior of the animals. You want to see the enrichment being effective. I get that. However, if your methodology is robust, if your science is robust, if you analyze the data properly and collected that data properly, all the things that Paul has mentioned, if that's the case, having non-significant results are still valid and they're definitely still worthy of publication. We want to be publishing those non-significant results, even if those results, if the science is robust, of course, it goes without saying, because, for example, if you're testing an enrichment device on, even if in a case study on a couple of animals, and you find that it's not statistically significant, maybe what it means is that you have to improve the way the enrichment is implemented. Maybe it's those two particular animals that are not responding to the enrichment, and we need to figure out why. Maybe it's an enrichment that's actually not a good enrichment for those particular animals, or maybe with more research find out that it's not good enrichment or effective enrichment for that species in captivity. And that is informative. That will allow us to determine what enrichment works, what enrichment is effective, what enrichment should zoos be investing their limited resources on. So just a side note, please don't be discouraged if you get non-significant results from your research. And just a quick summary. Multi-user studies are very useful. They can help you answering a lot of questions. Again, in particular, if you don't know what's going on and you want a comparative study of different things that zoos are doing and how that may affect behavior and welfare and health of the animals. However, these multi-zoo studies can also be logistically challenging. They can require a lot of paperwork. They can require a lot of collaborations, which can in times be challenging. And what you can do about that is to plan and prepare the best you can. You can develop solid partnerships and collaborations with your zoo partners by being transparent from the start and respectful. You can develop a sensible timeline that accounts for unexpected issues. And again, a timeline that all your partners are on board with. Communication is key. Remember to listen to and work with your partners, work with the zoo staff, be polite, be respectful, even when you're frustrated, even when you're stressed. Plan as much as you can to prepare for issues, but sometimes if the unexpected and unavoidable happens, like a global pandemic, then what you can do is work with what you have and acknowledge the limitations of your research, the limitations that those unexpected events brought into your research that are annoying, but if they were unavoidable, you can only acknowledge them and work with what you have. Statistically non-significant results, again, are valid and useful findings, so don't be discouraged if you get those from your research. And that's it, just a bit of a further reading if you're interested in reading this paper further to know some further tips on how to develop really successful research collaborations with zoos if you are in a university or vice versa. I think it's a very, very useful paper. But yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for watching.
Thanks, Ricardo. That was fabulous. So in terms of questions that we do have in the remaining time, I'm just going to go through them in no particular order. So you'll get your question answered one way, but so don't take offense if it's not verbally, if it's written. It's just how I'm going to go through the questions. But the first one that I'll ask to the group, because it's been voted as the highest, is, do you know of any innovative ways to perform visitor studies at zoos that do not involve surveys? And Andrew and Ricardo, I wondered if you had any ideas on that one.
I think the first one that comes to my mind would be direct observations, but with a big, be careful with the ethics of it, because it can maybe get tricky to get the ethics approved for those. But if you're looking for particular behaviors or particular conversations the zoos are having, the zoo visitors are having, that could be an interesting way of getting direct data. But then again, ethics, those can be tricky because you'll be watching people recording data directly from people. So make sure you get those ethics approved and well thought of.
I'm sure there is a paper from Andy Moss's group at Chester that did an eavesdropping study on conversations between zoo visitors. But again, the ethical implications of that and ensuring what you're doing is anonymized and you know exactly what you'll do with those data once you have collected them is key. So I think I would Google Dr. Andrew Moss if you're interested in that, because he has done a lot of visitor studies work in BIAZA and they're not all questionnaire based. The next question I wanted to take was from a zookeeper, and this is something we come across all of the time, and I think it's a really poignant one. As a zookeeper who also undertakes zoo research, I find that zoo colleagues can be very honest with me about their feelings towards research, i.e. they can't see the point, they're too busy, they don't have time, or is there a general lack of interest? Do you have any suggestions on how to manage this attitude?
I can jump in with some experience I guess we've had at Dublin. So I think the key thing that I have found is actually linking staff members with research. We have a lot of external researchers who come in and they come and do their study, but it never gets back to the team and the team are never involved with it. So we've made a concerted effort to bring the team into those discussions around designing the project, working with the researchers, being the point of contact for the researchers, so it's not an academic like myself. But also then working with them on things like how you're going to change the habitat or change the diet. And then at the end of it, bringing the results of what you found back to the zoo. Frequently, you'll do a research project, the results will go off somewhere and it'll never come back to us. So to really engage staff, we try to ask at least the students who work with us quite intensively to come back once they've finished and do a little like mini kind of conference over lunchtime. And that seems to be working to engage staff. We're always learning from it, but I think it's really key, just being open and communicative with your staff.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Ricardo, do you have anything to add from your experiences at Bristol?
I totally agree with Andrew. I think the key part is make sure that they are on board with the project so that they feel like they're being heard and they're not just being asked to do things, and instead they are part of planning the project, implementing the project, being asked for feedback. So what do you think of this plan? Do you agree with it? Are you happy with it? If not, what do you disagree with it? And sometimes there may be some disagreements and you may be able, if you discuss openly why they may be, I think most often, at least in my experience, I managed to find a place where everyone is happy or mostly happy. But yes, bring them on board with the project. I think that's the key aspect.
I also think there's going to be a shift change as the demographic of zookeepers changes and the more people that come through have a formalized science background. So I think that this might become less of a challenge to deal with in the future.
Yeah. I think just one final thing actually is in what we're trying to do here is actually use our keepers to get our research priorities and research questions, because if they're already invested in trying to get an answer, then they'll work harder to actually help the student and plan the project.
Yeah, we do the same at Bristol Zoo. That's a really good one. It's having their ideas, what you want, what you need done, and then we can work with that. It's a really good one.
Andrew, I think this is probably one for you. Thanks for the interesting talk. Can we put several files of different formats in the same repository?
Yes, you can. you can put anything you want basically in something like Zenodo. The key thing is that you don't just put it there, you also put all the explanation around what those different files are and what all the columns and all the information means. But yeah, you can definitely put different files together any way you want with those.
Thank you very much. Then there's been another question about, can you suggest some credible scientific journals for zoo research papers, both for reading reliable papers and for publishing? Do you folks have any top papers or articles that you like to go to as your first port of call for any science that you want to publish? That was my add-on to the question at the end, by the way.
For me, because of course I'm an applied animal behaviorist, I enjoy Applied Animal Behavior Science Journal. It was also the first journal I published as a first author, so I guess that's special meaning to me. I do like the zoo-based journals as well, like Zoo Biology. The more recent one, Journal of Zoological and Botanical Gardens. I think they're nice to publish. The zoo-based research that some journals frown upon, so I appreciate them for that. So I do enjoy those journals as well.
I feel the pain of whoever has posed that question, because there is a very well-known animal behavior journal that might be applied. You can work that one out. That seems to vacillate as to what it takes as zoo science. Sometimes it will take a zoo paper. Sometimes it says it's not right for the remit of the journal. So yeah, I do think for industry-led stuff to get to keepers, Zoo Biology, Journal of Zoo and Aquarium Research, and then the Journal of Zoological and Botanical Gardens is good. And off the back of that, we have a question about MDPI and do we consider them a predatory journal? So before I give my own 2 pennies worth on that one, Ricardo and Andrew, have you had any conversation with colleagues about MDPI?
You want to start, Andrew?
Yes, we have had some. I think it is a tricky one because at the end of the day, from an open science perspective, MDPI can be very good. It can be a great way to get your research out there to people without them having to pay for it. So there's pros and cons to everything. So I think I would err on the side of the pros, but I do think it does need to be restructured in certain ways to make it more open and accessible for the researcher and not actually the person trying to read the article.
I've had a couple of conversations with research colleagues at the conference that I'm currently at, and a general consensus seems to be that Journal of Zoological and Botanical Gardens is actually fine. Is how it's run, how it's structured, how it's reviewed. It's on the better end of the scale. And I think you need to look at the individual titles within MDPI rather than tarnishing them with the same brush. I haven't yet heard anything negative about JZBG. Is that right, Jonathan? Yeah,
Yes.
that one. So we've had a load of questions about ethics, so I thought I would answer these all together, and Andrew and Ricardo can jump in. So where do I get ethical approval? What is ethical approval? How do I engage with ethical approval? I'm an independent researcher. What is ethical approval? It has to be something that you engage with when you're writing your proposal and when you're doing your methods. And there seems to be a bit of miscommunication out there that if you're just doing an observational behavioural study, you don't need ethical approval. And that's not true, because even if you're not doing anything to the animals, your method should still be peer reviewed to make sure what you're doing is relevant to your question. So ethics is not just, I've got a home office license, I'm going to slice some mice up and do some drug trial. Ethics is also, am I going to collect valid data with this method? And then if I publish those data from that method, I know that what I have done is more likely to be reliable. So if you're in a zoo, by law, zoos should have an ethics committee. So find in your zoo who is that ethics committee. So for example, for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, that's me. So I get ethical reviews come to me, I farm them out to people that are involved. If you are in a university departments, centrally or locally, will have ethical review committees. So find out who your ethics representative is, and again, talk to them. Supervisors, managers, people that you report to should be able to tell you about the ethical review processes in your organization. If you are an independent researcher, that gets a little bit more tricky. And my best piece of advice to you would be, maybe don't try to do anything too heavy research-wise, just off your own back, if you don't have the support of an institution. But if you are a keeper and maybe you are doing some observations on animals that you have at home, or you're doing field observations in your own time, and they are just behavioural observations, reach out to somebody that you know in the field and ask them if they want to collaborate. So the example I can give you there are two former students of mine that were zookeepers, and over the COVID pandemic collected data on what those animals did, and they wanted to do something with them. So they reached out to me. I wasn't involved in what they actually did, but I got them the ethical approval for their project by submitting their methods to my university's department for review. So I think it's about building networks and connections and finding out your research friends. But it's a very good point, because you must engage with ethical review. You must make sure you take those comments on board. And it just looks better in your finished paper if you can say, who looked at this? When was it assessed? And then this was the final method. So I don't know, Ricardo and Andrew, if you have anything further you wanted to add to that.
No,
I think
I agree.
I would just say as well that when you're working with zoos, just be wary that sometimes zoos will accept university ethical approval, but there can be delays with zoos requiring further ethical approval depending what you're proposing. So if you are designing a project, just build in some contingency time for that as well.
I know we are out of time, so I'm just going to pose one final question, and then I will make sure that the others get some form of written response. And there's been a couple of questions about how do I become a zoo researcher, and how do I get funding for PhDs or similar. So I guess that you folks, as the newest people to complete PhDs and get zoo research jobs, rather than the pensioners like I am, do you want to just give a very brief explanation of how you got to where you are?
Sure. Shall I start? Okay, so some top tips. Relevant education, of course, it's very important. Likely not enough, I'm afraid, because it's a very competitive field. So on top of relevant education, relevant experience, that may require some unpaid work experience, which I think can be, not ideal, but in this competitive field, it usually requires that. So, and also networking. Those would be my three top tips: good relevant education, work experience, and network a lot so people know the amazing work you've done.
Yeah,
and come to the research conference in July.
And that.
Yeah, I think that's the same. I think for me, I did my undergraduate degree and then I went straight into a PhD with the same academic supervisor. So I think it's being very vocal about what you want and really trying to push your own narrative and your own plans with other academics who you think could support you. So for me, that worked out really well. And I think a big part of that is just networking, finding out who those academics are you want to collaborate with and who can help you get there as well. So, and a little bit of luck as well. You can't go wrong with that.
Brilliant. Okay, we will leave it there. So I will make sure that I copy the questions and we'll produce like a short response to those that we haven't got around to. But can I just say a big thank you to Ricardo and Andrew for giving their time up this evening. We do this for free. We're all volunteers on the research committee, and we do this for the love of the science and to forward the aims of BIAZA. So thank you very much for your work on this, and also thank you for everybody that has attended and asked such really interesting questions. It's been really nice to see the amount of engagement. So I hope you found it useful and interesting. I'll hand back to Frankie in the BIAZA office because I know that she has to do something fancy schmancy to make this into a format for sharing more widely. So thanks, folks, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks,
Take
guys.
care.